The story of William the Conqueror begins not in the green hills of England, but in the war-torn Duchy of Normandy, a land of shifting loyalties, feudal rivalries, and Viking heritage. By the early 11th century, Normandy was a duchy of France in name, but culturally and politically, it retained strong Scandinavian influences. The Normans were descendants of Norsemen who had settled in the region a century earlier, and their warrior spirit remained deeply embedded in the fabric of society. These were turbulent times where strength, strategy, and lineage were often the keys to survival. In this volatile context, William was born in 1027 or 1028 in the town of Falaise, the illegitimate son of Robert I, Duke of Normandy, and Herleva, the daughter of a local tanner. His birth outside of wedlock would later earn him the moniker William the Bastard, a name wielded by both enemies and chroniclers alike. In a deeply hierarchical and status-conscious society, illegitimacy could pose a major obstacle to authority. However, William's case would prove exceptional. The fact that his father publicly acknowledged him as his heir helped secure his place in the ducal succession, although it did not guarantee safety. Robert I, also known as Robert the Magnificent, was a relatively young and assertive duke who had seized power through both cunning and military might. His reign was marked by efforts to stabilize Norman politics, but tensions always simmered beneath the surface. Despite being unmarried and without a legitimate heir, Robert ensured that his son William would be recognized. Before departing on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem in 1035, Robert persuaded the Norman nobles to swear fealty to William as his successor. This act, though politically risky, was decisive in shaping William's future. The significance of this early pledge cannot be overstated. In feudal Europe, loyalty was a fragile commodity, often dependent on personal relationships and shifting power dynamics. The nobility's oath to a child born of a non-noble mother, and who had no direct legitimacy in the traditional sense, was a bold political experiment. As it would turn out, Robert never returned from his pilgrimage. He died in Nicaea in the Byzantine Empire, leaving the young William, barely 8 years old, to inherit the duchy. The death of Robert I threw Normandy into chaos. William's guardianship passed through a succession of regents, many of whom met violent ends. The duchy fell into a period of lawlessness, as rival factions sought to manipulate or eliminate the child duke to advance their own ambitions. Castles were seized, alliances were broken, and assassinations were rampant. William, despite his noble blood, lived with a target on his back from a very young age. It was not uncommon for him to be moved from castle to castle under the cover of night to evade plots against his life. This early instability forged in William a fierce sense of survival and an acute awareness of power's fragility. Unlike other noble children who were groomed in courts with luxurious education and ceremony, William's upbringing was one of vigilance and practical leadership. These formative years would instill in him a hardened resolve and a deep understanding of the volatile nature of politics, qualities that would later define his approach to both war and governance. Normandy itself, during this time, was not a unified polity in the modern sense, but a patchwork of baronial domains held together through tenuous loyalty to the ducal throne. The duke's authority relied on his ability to command respect, dispense justice, and enforce military might. With a child at the helm, the duchy's cohesion was endangered, and many feared a descent into civil war. Yet, William's survival and eventual consolidation of power marked the beginning of a remarkable ascent that would reshape not only Normandy, but the entire English-speaking world. It is also important to understand that William's background, half noble, half common, gave him a unique perspective. He was close enough to aristocratic privilege to claim its authority, yet distant enough from its traditions to challenge its rigidity. This dual identity allowed him to navigate the complexities of feudal politics with a combination of ambition and adaptability. He was not bound by convention, and that made him dangerous and effective. Furthermore, the legacy of his Viking ancestors lingered in his ambitions. The Normans had carved out their place in northern France through conquest and settlement, and that martial heritage was something William embraced fully. Even as a child, his survival depended not on bloodlines alone, but on his ability to assert himself, rally supporters, and project strength. These were the cornerstones upon which he would build his later conquests. The boy who would one day cross the English Channel as a conqueror first had to cross the perilous terrain of his own homeland, where danger came not from foreign invaders, but from within his own noble class. In the wake of Duke Robert's death, Normandy descended into a brutal and chaotic era where ambition and treachery ruled. For young William, the duchy that should have been his inheritance became a battlefield for survival. The Norman aristocracy, unbound by any deep loyalty to a child duke, turned against itself in a frenzy of opportunism. Castles were fortified not to defend the duchy, but to guard the personal interests of lords eager to carve out their own spheres of influence. Murder was not just a tool of war, it was a weapon of diplomacy. Regents appointed to guide William were assassinated with chilling regularity. Some were slain in their sleep, others ambushed on the roads between towns. No protector of William lasted long, and the line between friend and foe blurred with each passing year. Throughout his early adolescence, William moved like a shadow through his own duchy. Trusted allies smuggled him between strongholds under the cover of darkness, wary of the spies and daggers that awaited him on open roads. His residence was never fixed, and few could say for certain where he was on any given day. He was hidden in monasteries, sheltered in isolated fortresses, and kept away from the courts of power that would have been his by right. This was no royal childhood. It was an exercise in stealth and caution, a game of survival in which the stakes were life and death. Despite the constant threat to his life, William was not idle. He listened, he watched, he learned. In the great halls of his protectors, he observed the shifting loyalties of knights and barons. He saw the importance of alliances, the double-edged nature of trust, and the quiet strength of fear. By the time he reached his teenage years, William had acquired not only a soldier's resilience, but also a politician's instinct. These lessons were not taught by tutors. They were carved into his bones by necessity. As he grew taller and stronger, so too did his desire to reclaim control over the land that bore his name. He began to forge his own alliances, choosing his companions carefully, not on the basis of lineage, but on their reliability and ability. Men like Osber and Allen of Brittany became more than just counselors. They were the scaffolding that supported his gradual rise. With their aid, William began to exert influence beyond his immediate circle. He was no longer just the Duke in name. He was becoming a force that could not be ignored. In the backdrop of this transformation, Normandy was changing too. The bloodshed of the Regency period had worn thin the patience of its nobility. Many longed for order, for a leader who could bring stability without sacrificing strength. William's emergence as a survivor, and now a young man of action, offered just that possibility. He was not yet feared, but he was no longer dismissed. His adversaries began to tread more carefully, calculating whether it was better to destroy him now or pledge their loyalty before others did. One of the earliest tests of his growing authority came during a rebellion led by rebellious Norman barons who sought to oust him altogether. The conflict, fierce and unforgiving, took place near the village of Valies-Dunes. William, still only in his early 20s, called upon the support of the French King Henry I, a rare alliance born more from political interest than personal favor. With the king's troops at his side, William confronted the insurrection. The result was decisive. The rebellion was crushed, and the rebellious lords either slain or exiled. It was William's first true military triumph, and it sent a clear message across Normandy. That victory marked a turning point in William's life. No longer the hunted boy hidden in abbeys and castles. He was now the hunter, commanding armies and demanding fealty. His rule remained contested in places, but his claim to power could no longer be questioned outright. With blood and steel, he had begun the transformation from a survivor to a sovereign. And while Normandy was far from pacified, its most dangerous era of instability was beginning to recede under William's watchful iron gaze. Still, peace in Normandy was not peace in William's heart. The betrayals he had endured and the threats he had outlived left their mark. He grew into a man of guarded confidence, quick to assert dominance, slow to forget an offense. Trust remained a rare commodity in his court, and he ruled with a blend of calculated generosity and ruthless discipline. Those who served him loyally were rewarded beyond their station. Those who crossed him rarely got a second chance. By the time William reached full adulthood, he had become a figure of both admiration and fear. He had not inherited a peaceful duchy. He had seized it, molded it, and fortified it with his own hands. The Normandy he now ruled was his by right, not only of blood, but of will. The struggles of his youth had forged a duke unlike any before him, resilient, cunning, and utterly determined. What began as a fragile inheritance had become the foundation of an empire still to come. When the smoke of rebellion had cleared and the ground firmed beneath his feet, William stood not just as a survivor of Norman turmoil, but as its undisputed ruler. Yet authority in name was a far cry from absolute power. Normandy, scarred by civil unrest and mistrust, required more than a duke with a sword. It needed a ruler with vision, control, and unwavering resolve. William, now firmly in his 20s, faced the arduous task of transforming a fractured duchy into a disciplined and obedient domain. The first challenge lay in subduing the remaining barons who had survived the earlier conflicts but refused to acknowledge William's sovereignty in practice. These lords still acted as if their castles were independent fiefdoms, issuing their own justice and levying private armies. William, aware of the delicate balance between force and diplomacy, began a campaign not of open war, but of strategic assertion. One by one, he traveled to these strongholds, sometimes arriving with an army, other times with carefully chosen emissaries or generous offers. But the message was consistent. The days of rogue autonomy were over. To reinforce his authority, William turned to a cornerstone of medieval power, marriage. In the early 1050s, he pursued a union with Matilda of Flanders, daughter of Baldwin V, Count of Flanders, one of the most powerful lords in Northern Europe. Their marriage, despite initial opposition from the papacy due to consanguinity, was a masterstroke of political alliance. It not only secured peace with a strong neighbor, but elevated William's status among European nobility. The union bore children, ensuring a stable line of succession, and Matilda herself became a trusted advisor and regent in his absence. William's political maneuvers were matched by his military innovations. He began to reorganize Normandy's military structure, reinforcing loyalty through land grants and clearly defined obligations of service. Knights who had proven themselves in battle were rewarded with fiefs, but only on the condition of unwavering allegiance to the duke. William did not tolerate duplicity. Lands could just as easily be taken away as they were given. This merit-based redistribution helped to dilute the power of entrenched noble families and fostered a new generation of military dependents bound directly to him. But perhaps one of William's most effective tools of consolidation was the castle. While fortified structures had existed in Normandy before, under William's rule, they multiplied and evolved. Castles were no longer mere strongholds. They became instruments of governance, surveillance, and projection of ducal power. Erected at strategic points across the duchy, these imposing structures served as physical reminders of William's reach. From their walls flew his banner, and within them sat his appointed stewards. For his enemies, they were a warning. For his subjects, a symbol of order. Justice, too, became a realm in which William asserted his dominance. The disarray of previous years had eroded the institutions of law, and in their place, William installed his own code of conduct. He convened ducal courts where cases were heard and decisions rendered with the authority of his seal. His justice was often harsh, but it was also consistent, an important distinction in an age where fairness was often subject to noble whim. Through the restoration of law and order, William earned grudging respect even from those who feared him. Church reform also played a critical role in William's state-building efforts. He began replacing politically entangled or morally lax clergy with men of piety and learning, many of whom were loyal to him personally. By aligning himself with religious reform movements spreading across Europe, William presented himself as a Christian ruler of integrity, not just a warlord clinging to power. His favor with reformist clerics also earned him valuable alliances within the broader sphere of Christendom, including contacts in Rome that would later prove crucial. Meanwhile, economic stability began to take root under William's rule. Trade routes were secured, markets were regulated, and the ports of Normandy began to bustle with foreign merchants once again. Towns like Rouen, Caen, and Bayeux became centers of commerce and administration. William encouraged the growth of towns not merely for revenue, but as a counterbalance to rural baronial power. Urban populations, with their different loyalties and ambitions, gave him a new base of support less tied to the feudal nobility. Culturally, William fostered a sense of Norman identity that extended beyond family or clan. He patronized monastic institutions that chronicled his reign, commissioned religious works, and encouraged the use of Latin and Old French in courtly documents. These efforts helped craft a narrative of legitimacy and continuity. Under William's guidance, the duchy began to see itself not as a coalition of squabbling lords, but as a centralized state ruled by a single, divinely sanctioned duke. By the close of the 1050s, William's authority in Normandy was virtually unchallenged. What had begun as a desperate effort to survive had become a calculated campaign of unification and control. He had rebuilt Normandy from the ground up, reshaped its nobility, reforged its military, and redefined its political landscape. The boy once hidden from assassins now stood as one of the most formidable rulers in Western Europe. But William's ambition did not end at the banks of the Seine. With Normandy firmly in his grasp, his gaze began to drift across the English Channel, to a kingdom in disarray and to a throne that he believed was rightfully his. As William tightened his grip on Normandy, another realm began to drift into his sights. England, a land divided by ambition, tradition, and an uncertain future. The English crown, though distant from Norman shores, had always loomed large in William's political imagination. It was more than a distant island kingdom. It was a realm of opportunity, deeply entangled with Normandy by blood, allegiance, and rivalry. And by the early 1060s, the question of who would inherit the English throne had become one of the most pressing and perilous questions in Christendom. At the heart of this looming crisis was Edward the Confessor, the King of England. Childless and aging, Edward had ruled with an air of sanctity but little political vigor. His court was a battleground for competing factions, including the powerful Godwin family of Wessex and Norman allies whom Edward had brought with him during his early exile in Normandy. It was during this exile, decades earlier, that Edward had become acquainted with the Norman court and, according to later Norman sources, had promised the English crown to William. The claim that Edward had designated William as his heir would become central to the Duke's future ambitions. Whether this promise was ever formally made remains a matter of historical debate. But what mattered most to William was that the claim existed and that it was believable enough to rally support both at home and abroad. The complex web of English-Norman relations gave the story a compelling edge. Edward had Norman roots, had surrounded himself with Norman advisors, and had even placed Norman clergy in English bishoprics. The cultural and political ties between the two lands were undeniable. For William, the prospect of ascending to the English throne was not just a matter of honor. It was the culmination of a long-term geopolitical strategy. A ruler of England would possess not only greater prestige, but also vast lands and resources that could elevate Normandy from a duchy to the heart of a new trans-channel empire. William understood that securing the crown would require more than a claim. It would demand international recognition, diplomatic groundwork, and a readiness to use force if diplomacy failed. Diplomatic efforts began to take shape years before Edward's death. William cultivated relationships with neighboring rulers, including the French King Philip I and the papacy, both of whom held considerable influence in legitimizing royal claims. He sent envoys to foreign courts, strengthened family ties through marriage alliances, and even received informal assurances of support from some of England's internal rivals. But despite his efforts, William knew that England itself remained a fiercely independent realm, governed by its own customs and guarded by ambitious nobles who would not easily accept a foreign-born ruler. One such noble loomed large, Harold Godwin's son, Earl of Wessex. As the most powerful man in England after the king, Harold wielded immense political influence. He had led military campaigns on Edward's behalf, governed vast lands, and enjoyed the loyalty of many English lords. William was aware that Harold posed the greatest threat to his aspirations. In a controversial episode recounted by Norman chroniclers, Harold allegedly traveled to Normandy and swore an oath to support William's claim to the throne. Whether this was done freely, under duress, or manipulated later as propaganda remains unclear, but William seized upon it as a binding promise. This oath would later become a moral weapon for William. In a world where feudal loyalty and sacred vows underpinned political legitimacy, Harold's supposed betrayal would be painted not merely as a personal affront, but as a sacrilege, an oath breaker defying divine and legal order. William would wield this narrative with skill, preparing the ideological ground for eventual conflict. He cast himself not as an invader, but as the rightful heir betrayed, seeking justice rather than conquest. Meanwhile, William continued to study England. Through merchants, travelers, and spies, he gathered intelligence about the kingdom's military strength, its noble families, its internal divisions, and its coastal defenses. He knew that many in the north of England distrusted the southern Godwin dynasty. He knew that the powerful earls in Mercia and Northumbria were prone to rebellion. England, for all its surface strength, was politically fragile, a patchwork of regional loyalties ripe for disruption. The religious dimension also began to take shape. William, always adept at aligning his ambitions with the church, began courting support from key ecclesiastical figures. The church's approval would be essential not only to legitimize his claim, but to frame his actions as righteous. In an age where conquest could be rendered holy with the right blessing, William's approach was as much theological as it was political. The seeds of a divinely sanctioned campaign were already being planted. By the mid-1060s, William was a man preparing not just for war, but for inheritance. He positioned himself as the rightful successor to Edward, the victim of a treacherous oath-breaker and a ruler chosen by God to bring order to a distant kingdom. His court in Normandy became a hub of planning, where maps of English terrain were unrolled, knights sharpened their blades, and clerics crafted the narrative of a just crusade. The sea between Normandy and England no longer looked like a barrier. It looked like a path. And then, in early 1066, the news came. Edward the Confessor was dead, and Harold Godwin's son had taken the crown. For William, this was not merely a disappointment. It was a provocation. The time for diplomacy had passed. The cross-channel chessboard had been set, and William, ever the calculating player, was ready to make his move. In the months following Edward the Confessor's death, William's court at Rouen transformed from a seat of ducal power into the nerve center of a military enterprise unlike any Normandy had ever seen. The news that Harold Godwin's son had seized the English crown did not stir panic in William. It ignited purpose. This was the moment he had prepared for, the culmination of years of political maneuvering. But seizing a kingdom across a hostile sea required more than ambition. It demanded men, ships, resources, faith, and timing. The initial days were consumed with intense planning. William convened his most trusted advisors, both secular and ecclesiastical, behind closed doors. Maps of southern England were laid out upon stone tables, showing the likely paths of resistance and the positioning of key strongholds. Every detail mattered: tides, winds, harvest seasons, troop logistics. The channel was not just a body of water. It was a volatile frontier that had to be crossed under precisely the right conditions. Securing the support of Normandy's nobles was William's first priority. Though many of his knights had proven loyal during the pacification of the duchy, few had ever embarked on a campaign of such uncertain outcome. William offered not merely honor, but tangible rewards. The lands of rebellious English nobles, the wealth of abbeys, and the possibility of establishing new lordships in a foreign kingdom were all promised to those who joined the cause. It was a gamble, one that played on the dreams of land-hungry knights and minor lords eager to rise above their station. The scale of the mobilization was unprecedented. For months, the Norman countryside was consumed by activity. Fields near the coast were converted into training camps. Forges worked day and night to produce swords, chainmail, spearheads, and horseshoes. Shipbuilders labored feverishly along the river dives and the coastal towns of Barfleur and St. Valery, constructing vessels designed to carry both men and horses across the treacherous channel waters. The air was thick with the clang of metal and the neighing of war horses. But William understood that brute force would not be enough to justify his claim. The moral legitimacy of his expedition needed to be sealed by a higher authority. He dispatched envoys to the court of Pope Alexander II, seeking not only permission but divine endorsement. William's emissaries, accompanied by Norman clergy, presented the case against Harold. An oath broken, a rightful heir denied, and the promise of a ruler who would protect and reform the English Church. The Pope, persuaded by both argument and political interest, granted his blessing, and with it, a consecrated banner that would accompany William into battle. This papal support transformed the nature of the campaign. What had been a dynastic dispute was now, in the eyes of many, a holy endeavor. Soldiers were told they were fighting not just for land, but for divine justice. The Church's backing helped rally broader support from neighboring regions, and mercenaries from Brittany, Flanders, and even parts of southern France began arriving in Normandy to join the cause. William's army became a patchwork of languages and loyalties, all bound by the promise of reward and righteousness. Logistics became a monumental challenge. William established a supply system to ensure the steady flow of grain, salted meat, wine, and fodder to the growing camps near the embarkation ports. Horses, crucial for the cavalry that would serve as the spine of his army, had to be trained for sea travel, loaded on especially designed vessels, and kept calm for the voyage ahead. Experienced sailors were recruited to navigate the unpredictable waters and to manage the fleet, which now numbered several hundred ships. Timing the departure proved more difficult than expected. In the summer of 1066, contrary winds and storms delayed the fleet for weeks, stranding the soldiers in coastal camps. Morale wavered, and supplies began to dwindle. Yet William remained composed. He walked among the men, speaking with captains, dining with his knights, and visiting chapels with his wife, Matilda, who remained by his side until the very eve of the crossing. His presence inspired discipline. It was clear to all that their leader was not a distant commander, but a man willing to share their hunger, their boredom, and soon, their peril. Then came an unexpected turn. News arrived that a Norse invasion force, led by King Harald Hardrada of Norway and joined by Harold Godwinson's exiled brother Tostig, had landed in the north of England. Harold of England was forced to march his army northward to confront this fresh threat. William saw the opportunity with the eyes of a seasoned tactician. With Harold's forces diverted, the southern coast of England lay vulnerable. The time to strike had come. At last, the wind turned. On the night of September 27th, 1066, William gave the order to set sail. Torches lined the decks of the Norman fleet as it pushed away from the French coast beneath a moonless sky. The journey was not just across water, but into legend. Behind him, William left a stable duchy. Ahead of him waited the fate of a kingdom. The storm he had prepared for was no longer brewing. It had begun to break. The Norman fleet made landfall in England not with fanfare, but with precision. On the morning of September 28th, 1066, William's ships reached the shores of Pevensey in Sussex, their sails tattered from the crossing, but their resolve intact. The calm of the early autumn morning belied the historical weight of the moment. No foreign army of such scale had set foot on English soil in centuries. As the vessels grounded on the shingle beach, soldiers leapt ashore, horses were unloaded, and banners bearing William's emblem were hoisted into the wind. The landing was remarkably unopposed. The southern coast of England, left largely undefended due to King Harold's rapid march north to repel the Norwegian threat, lay vulnerable. William acted swiftly. He understood that this initial window of opportunity was narrow. His forces disembarked with discipline, immediately establishing a fortified base at Hastings. Defensive earthworks were constructed, and timber from nearby forests was harvested to build palisades, while scouts fanned out to secure surrounding villages and roads. In the neighboring countryside, the arrival of the Normans sent ripples of uncertainty through the local population. The villagers of Sussex, accustomed to the rhythms of harvest and prayer, now found themselves under the looming shadow of an invading army. Yet William was careful to maintain order among his men. Looting was strictly forbidden without command, and any soldier caught mistreating civilians faced harsh punishment. William did not want chaos. He wanted control. The conquest, in his mind, had to be both military and moral. To sustain his army, William established supply chains through the surrounding territory. He requisitioned grain, livestock, and other necessities from nearby manors, leaving behind tokens of compensation, partly as a sign of legitimacy, and partly as a calculated political move. He also issued assurances to local leaders. Those who swore fealty to him would retain their lands and privileges. This approach sowed both fear and hesitation among the English gentry, some of whom began quietly sending emissaries to gauge William's intentions. While his soldiers fortified Hastings and adjusted to the unfamiliar terrain, William made use of the time to train and reorganize his troops. Drills were conducted daily. Knights practiced cavalry charges on the nearby downs. Archers refined their technique, and foot soldiers rehearsed formations. William wanted his forces to be not only ready, but razor-sharp. He knew that a confrontation with Harold was inevitable. What he did not know was when or under what conditions it would occur. To ensure communication and cohesion within his increasingly multinational army, William appointed trusted lieutenants to command units of diverse origin. Normans, Bretons, Flemings, and mercenaries from other regions had differing customs and languages, but under William's leadership, they moved with unified discipline. His chain of command was strict, his messages clear, and his expectations unambiguous. Loyalty was not merely expected, it was demanded. At night, campfires flickered across the Norman encampment like stars fallen to earth. Soldiers told tales of home, sharpened their weapons, and gazed into the darkness toward the north. Rumors of Harold's battle with the Norwegians began to filter in through local informants. Whispers told of a great conflict near Stamford Bridge, of a hard-fought English victory, but also of heavy losses and exhaustion. William absorbed this information with the quiet calculation of a predator sensing the wound of its prey. He sent riders to scout deep into enemy territory. These men were instructed to observe roads, troop movements, and the mood of the countryside. What they brought back confirmed William's growing confidence. Harold had won the north, but at great cost, and was now forced to march south with a weary and diminished army. The timing was impeccable. William now held the initiative. He had established a foothold, fortified his base, and trained his men, all while Harold's forces were struggling to regroup. By early October, William was no longer simply occupying Sussex. He was staging it. His army was ready. Horses were fed and rested, arrows fletched and stored, swords honed. The Duke, clad in armor and riding his warhorse through the ordered ranks of his encampment, looked every inch the sovereign he claimed to be. No longer merely a claimant or a challenger, he stood as a commander-in-waiting, poised for the decisive clash that would determine the fate of a crown. All eyes now turned toward the horizon. Messengers had confirmed that Harold was approaching. William, ever the strategist, allowed himself a moment of reflection. The sands beneath his boots had once belonged to his rival. Soon, he believed, they would belong to him. The morning of October 14th, 1066, dawned over the Sussex countryside with a chill mist creeping along the ridges of Senlac Hill. Atop this high ground stood the army of Harold Godwin's son, his housecarls, herdsmen, and noble retainers forming a formidable shield wall that stretched the crest like a living fortress. Below, on the lower slope, William of Normandy marshaled his forces with the same methodical precision that had guided every step of his campaign. The long-anticipated battle for the English crown was upon them, and no man present would leave unchanged. The two armies faced each other across a shallow valley, the English on the defensive, the Normans arrayed in distinct lines of archers, infantry, and cavalry. William had divided his army by region, placing Bretons on one wing, Normans in the center, and Flemings on the other. Trumpets blared as commands rippled down the ranks. Above them all, William's standard fluttered alongside the consecrated papal banner, a symbol of both divine sanction and unwavering ambition. The initial clash began with a volley of arrows launched uphill by Norman archers. Yet the English shield wall held firm, the missiles glancing off wooden bucklers and iron helmets. Realizing the limited impact of this first salvo, William ordered his infantry forward. As they surged up the slope, they were met with a thunderous response. The English held their line, axes swinging in devastating arcs, cutting down attackers who dared break their ranks. Blood soaked the earth as men fell on both sides, their cries mingling with the clash of steel and the beat of war drums. The turning point of the morning came not from command, but confusion. On the left flank, Breton troops faltered under the weight of the English defense and began to retreat. Panic briefly spread through the Norman lines. A rumor took hold that William himself had fallen, causing disarray among his men. But in a moment that would become the stuff of legend, William rode among his troops, lifting his helmet to reveal his face. His presence rallied the army. Order was restored. The tide would not turn so easily against the Norman Duke. What began as a setback evolved into opportunity. William, observing the English response to the Breton flight, recognized a weakness. The defenders had broken formation to pursue the fleeing Normans, abandoning the cohesion of their shield wall. Sensing a tactical advantage, William ordered feigned retreats at intervals, tricks of movement and illusion that lured the English into leaving their line. Each time, the Normans circled back and struck the exposed flanks of their opponents with deadly precision. The battlefield became a theater of both brute force and psychological warfare. Horsemen rode in tight formations. Lances aimed at soft spots in the English line. Arrows continued to arc overhead, now launched in coordinated rhythms. Some aimed high to fall behind the front line where reserves waited. The housecarls, elite English warriors sworn to Harold, stood their ground with grim determination, their great axes claiming a toll with every swing. Yet as the day wore on, even their strength began to wane. The rhythm of the battle was relentless. Dust and sweat mingled with blood, the air filled with the iron scent of death. William fought at the front, visible to all, his leadership direct and fearless. He spurred his horse repeatedly into the fray, his sword flashing, his voice rising above the din to give commands. His presence inspired courage and demanded obedience. Around him, his commanders executed the battle plan with coordinated strikes and disciplined withdrawals. As the sun began to lower, casting long shadows over the carnage, William made a final, decisive gamble. He ordered his archers to adjust their aim, no longer firing flat and low, but high into the air. The arrows fell in deadly arcs over the heads of the Norman infantry and into the tightly packed English line. Amid this hail of missiles, a shaft struck Harold. According to later accounts, it pierced his eye, felling him where he stood. Whether myth or truth, Harold's death marked the disintegration of English resistance. With their king fallen and morale broken, the English line finally gave way. What had been a stalwart wall of warriors became a tide of fleeing men. Norman cavalry swept the field, cutting down survivors and securing the final moments of victory. By nightfall, Senlac Hill was quiet again, but strewn with the bodies of thousands. Fires flickered as the Normans tended their wounded and counted their dead. Above them, the standards of Normandy and the papacy stood victorious. William's triumph at Hastings was not merely a military victory. It was a culmination of strategy, discipline, and foresight. In the days following the bloody triumph at Hastings, the Norman camp bore the atmosphere not of jubilation, but of sober resolve. Victory on the battlefield was only the first step. William understood that the crown of England would not simply descend upon his head. London, the heart of Anglo-Saxon power and the seat of its nobility, had not yet yielded. While Harold lay dead on the field, his brothers and surviving nobles had fled, and with them the threat of renewed resistance. The conquest, though now inevitable, still demanded careful execution. William began his advance with calculated patience. Rather than march directly on London, he turned eastward, sweeping through the countryside of Kent and Surrey. His army moved as both conqueror and administrator, seizing supplies, establishing garrisons, and leaving behind a trail of fortified positions to secure lines of communication and retreat. Every town that surrendered was spared. Every one that resisted faced swift punishment. This balance of terror and diplomacy set the tone for the weeks ahead. As the Normans approached, the political atmosphere within London grew increasingly tense. The city's elders and ecclesiastical leaders convened behind closed doors, debating whether to resist the invader or submit in hopes of preserving order. Some advocated for crowning Edgar Atheling, the teenage grandson of Edmund Ironside, as a symbolic figurehead. Others, more pragmatic, feared the devastation a Norman siege would bring. The memory of the Battle of Hastings weighed heavily on them. They had seen what William's determination could accomplish. Meanwhile, William's progress was methodical. He captured key river crossings, burned strategic villages to prevent ambush, and negotiated with wavering nobles. His fleet had also moved along the coast, providing support and ensuring a continued flow of supplies. He was not merely pursuing a crown, he was enclosing the kingdom. He crossed the Thames at Wallingford, bypassing the heavily defended bridges, and positioned himself southwest of London. It was a masterstroke of positioning. He had encircled the city without ever launching a frontal assault. From his new position, William opened formal negotiations with the city's leaders. Envoys passed between his camp and the city walls, carrying terms of peace, promises of pardon, and veiled threats. He pledged to uphold English laws, protect the church, and reward those who submitted. It was not only a military campaign now, it was a contest of legitimacy. William sought not only to conquer England, but to be accepted by it. He did not want to rule as an outsider, but as a rightful sovereign. The approach worked. Slowly, English nobles began to defect. Edwin and Morcar, powerful northern earls who had initially supported Edgar, came to William's camp to submit. With their allegiance broken, resistance within London crumbled. The Archbishop of York, along with several prominent bishops and abbots, offered their support. The people of London, exhausted and leaderless, opened their gates without a fight. William entered not as a marauder, but as a claimant who had proved his claim. On Christmas Day of 1066, in the solemn chill of Westminster Abbey, William was crowned King of England. The ceremony was conducted by Ealdred, Archbishop of York, symbolizing continuity with English tradition. As the congregation cried out in acclamation, first in English, then in Norman French, William's guards outside mistook the shouting for an attack and set fire to nearby buildings in panic. Smoke drifted into the abbey, mingling with the incense. It was a strange, uneasy coronation, fitting for a kingdom caught between worlds. The following weeks were spent consolidating control. William sent trusted lieutenants to occupy major towns, including Winchester, where the royal treasury lay. He secured the loyalty of key abbots and bishops through rewards and reform promises. Castles were commissioned, first at Dover and Hastings, then in London, to anchor Norman power. These stone and timber fortresses were not just defensive structures. They were visible symbols of conquest, alien and unignorable, rising over English skylines. Yet even in victory, William moved with vigilance. He retained a sizable army within England and kept open lines to Normandy, knowing that loyalty won through fear or fatigue could fade. He began a careful redistribution of English land to his Norman followers, laying the groundwork for a new aristocracy. The process was slow, deliberate, and deeply disruptive, reshaping centuries of feudal structure in favor of his own vassals. By the spring of 1067, William had returned briefly to Normandy to display his triumph. He brought with him English hostages, lavish spoils, and a symbolic confirmation of his new status. But the conquest of England, though declared and crowned, remained an unfinished work. Rebellions would come, regions would resist. Yet on the road to London, William had transformed from a foreign duke into a sovereign king, and in doing so, had redrawn the map of Europe. Though crowned and hailed as king, William's throne remained far from secure. The English crown, won through force and diplomacy, still sat uneasily on Norman shoulders. The land simmered with unrest, its people unwilling to forget the fallen house of Godwin's son. In the years following his coronation, William faced a series of uprisings that tested not only his military acumen, but his will to dominate a kingdom that had not chosen him. The first sparks of resistance flared in the west and north, where loyalty to Anglo-Saxon traditions and regional autonomy remained strong. In 1067, while William visited Normandy to present his conquest, revolts broke out in Kent and in the Welsh marches. They were small and swiftly crushed, but they signaled a deeper undercurrent of rebellion. The English were not passive subjects. They had accepted William's rule only under the duress of arms, and some now sought to reverse the tide. By 1068, resistance grew bolder. Edwin and Morcar, who had previously submitted to William, rebelled anew, joined by other powerful nobles who resented the erosion of their ancestral rights. In Exeter, the people closed their gates and refused to pay taxes. William responded with decisive force, marching to the city with an army and laying siege. After 18 days, Exeter surrendered and William spared it, though he built a massive stone castle to ensure its future obedience. The most serious and sustained threat arose in the north. Northumbria had always been distant from the rule of southern kings, and its people were fiercely independent. In 1069, a rebellion in York erupted, supported by Danish forces arriving by sea. The rebels captured Norman strongholds and declared open defiance. For William, this was intolerable. The North had to be subdued, not just in name, but in submission. William responded with what would become one of the most infamous campaigns in medieval English history, the harrying of the North. Through the winter of 1069 and into early 1070, he led his forces across Yorkshire, burning villages, destroying crops, and salting the fields to prevent regrowth. Livestock were slaughtered, stores of grain were seized or incinerated, and entire populations were left to starve. The devastation was brutal and systematic, a scorched earth campaign designed not just to defeat, but to annihilate resistance. The scale of the destruction left a permanent scar. Monasteries recorded tales of famine and death, of corpses unburied and fields abandoned. Survivors fled into forests and moors, or surrendered in desperation. By the end of the campaign, the North had been pacified through fear and famine. No further large-scale revolts would emerge from that region for years. William had sent a clear message: rebellion would be met with ruin. Even within the church, there were murmurs of discontent. Many English bishops had been replaced with Norman counterparts, and William sought to bring the church under tighter royal control. He demanded loyalty not only in faith, but in fealty, removing clergymen who defied him and installing loyalists like Lanfranc as Archbishop of Canterbury. Ecclesiastical reform, conducted under the guise of piety, served his greater goal of centralized authority. Castles continued to rise across the land. At Warwick, Nottingham, Lincoln, and beyond, each built not only for defense, but as instruments of rule. These fortresses housed garrisons, served as administrative centers and loomed over the population as physical assertions of Norman dominance. The very skyline of England was being transformed, stone by stone, into a landscape of submission. Yet William was not without challenges from abroad. The King of Scotland offered shelter to English rebels, and there were whispers of foreign invasions that never fully materialized. William responded by reinforcing his frontiers, negotiating treaties, and making calculated raids across the border to demonstrate his reach. He maintained a delicate balance, wielding terror to maintain order and diplomacy to prevent isolation. By the early 1070s, William had re-established control over the realm, but the cost was immense. The land bore the wounds of war. The population had been thinned by sword and starvation, and the Anglo-Saxon aristocracy had been all but replaced. Through fire and steel, William had secured his kingdom, but the peace he imposed was cold, earned not by love or legacy, but by the unrelenting force of a conqueror determined never to be defied again. As the 11th century neared its final decades, William stood not only as King of England, but as Duke of Normandy, a ruler who straddled two worlds, commanding loyalty on both sides of the Channel. Yet this duality came with constant strain. Governance of two distinct realms required constant attention, travel, and a delicate balancing of alliances. The latter part of William's reign was defined less by conquest and more by the burden of maintaining the empire he had forged in blood. William spent much of his time in Normandy, overseeing legal reforms, mediating noble disputes, and reinforcing his feudal network. He delegated rule in England to trusted regents, but remained ever watchful, summoning magnates to his court and asserting his authority through strict enforcement of royal justice. His governance was rigid and methodical. The crown's reach extended deep into local life, and the king's influence was felt in every shire through a vast apparatus of sheriffs, clerks, and knights. His family life, however, became increasingly complex. As his sons grew into adulthood, tensions emerged. Robert Curthose, the eldest, was ambitious and impatient. He sought autonomy in Normandy and demanded recognition as heir, leading to open conflict with his father. Their feud erupted into violence in the late 1070s, culminating in Robert's rebellion and a dramatic clash at Gerberoi, where father and son met on the battlefield. Though reconciliation was eventually achieved, the incident strained familial ties and exposed the vulnerability behind William's iron rule. William's health began to decline in the 1080s. Years of military campaigns, travel, and political stress had taken their toll. Yet he continued to govern with determination. One of his most enduring acts during this period was commissioning the Domesday Book in 1085. This unprecedented survey of land, property, and resources across England was a marvel of administrative ambition. It catalogued every manor, tenant, and plough team, reflecting William's desire for total oversight, a realm where nothing was hidden from the crown. The survey, completed in remarkable time, served both fiscal and symbolic purposes. It enabled efficient taxation, confirmed landholdings, and reinforced the legitimacy of Norman authority. But more than that, it captured a moment in time, a frozen image of a country transformed by conquest, reorganized under a new elite, and bound by oaths of loyalty to a foreign king. In many ways, it was the perfect expression of William's rule, precise, controlling, and permanent. Conflict with France would mark William's final campaign. King Philip I of France, ever wary of Norman power, had provoked William with insults and territorial incursions. In 1087, at the age of 60, William led his army across the border and laid waste to the region of Vexin. During the sack of the town of Mantes, the aging king suffered a grievous injury, thrown violently from his horse amid the burning ruins. The wound turned serious, and he was carried back to Rouen, where his condition worsened. William's final days were somber and reflective. As he lay dying in a monastery, he ordered his attendants to distribute his possessions, and he attempted to make peace with his enemies. His last wishes revealed the weight of his conscience and the clarity of a ruler aware of his mortal limits. To Robert, he left Normandy, as promised. William Rufus, his third son, was bequeathed the crown of England. To his second son, Henry, he gave money but no land, a decision that would later ignite fraternal strife. The king died on September 9, 1087. His passing, despite all his achievements, was not marked by glory. His body was abandoned by attendants, looted by servants, and hastily buried in Cannes. The funeral was marred by chaos, his corpse too large for the sarcophagus, the church unfinished, and a local man interrupting the ceremony to claim the land as stolen. Even in death, William's legacy stirred resentment and discord. Yet despite the indignities of his final moments, William left a kingdom forever changed. His conquest altered the language, law, culture, and structure of English society. French replaced English at court, and the nobility became a class of foreign lords bound by feudal obligation. Castles dotted the countryside, towns were fortified, and monastic life was reshaped under continental influence. The Norman grip on England would remain for centuries, shaping the path of the nation through its kings, laws, and customs. William's legacy lies not only in what he conquered, but in how he ruled. He brought to England a new model of kingship, absolute, centralized, and supported by meticulous record-keeping and military might. His reign set precedents for governance and control that echoed far beyond his lifetime. And though his life ended in fire and pain, the shadow he cast over England remained long after the man himself was gone.